"Well, we're not dead yet," Kit said, and peered around the corner of 60th and 5th, and then jumped back, pale with shock. "We're dead," he said, turned around, and began running back the way they had come, though he limped doing it. Nita looked around that corner just long enough to see what he had seen. A whole pack of big yellow cabs, thundering down 60th. The one in front had a twisted fender that stuck out slightly on one side, a jagged piece of metal. She turned and ran after Kit, frantic. "Where can we hide?" "The buildings are locked here, too," Kit said from up ahead. He had been trying doors. "Fred, can you do something?" "After that last emission? So soon?" Fred's thought was shaken. "It's all I can do to radiate light. I need time to recover." "Crud. Kit, the park. Maybe the trees will slow them down." They both ran for the curb, but there was no time. Cabs came roaring around the corner from 60th, and another pack of them leaped around the corner of 61st and hurtled down 5th toward them. They would never make it across the street. Kit grabbed for his antenna, and Nita yanked out the wand, but without much hope. It hadn't worked that well on the helicopter. The cabs slowed, closed in from both sides, forming a half circle with Kit and Nita and Fred at the center, backing them against the wall of a dingy building. The cordon tightened until there were no gaps, and one cab at each side was up on the sidewalk, blocking it. No matter where Nita looked, all she saw were chromed grills like gritted teeth, hungry headlights staring. One of the cabs shouldered forward, its engine snarling softly. The jagged place at one end of its front fender wore a brown discoloration. Not rust, Kit's blood, which it had tasted. Kit lifted the antenna, the hand that gripped it shaking. The high-pitched yowl of rage and defiance from outside the circle jerked Kit's head up. Nita stared. Fenders scraped and rattled against one another as the tight-wedged cabs jostled, trying to see what was happening. Even the blood-stained cab, the pack leader, looked away from Kit. But none of them could move any way but backward, and one cab paid immediately for that limitation as a fanged grill bit deep into its hindquarters and dragged it screaming out of the circle. Metal screeched and tore, glass shattered, as the Lotus Esprit's jaws crushed through the cab's trunk, ripped away its rear axle, and with a quick sideways shake of its front end, flung the bitten-off axle crashing down Fifth Avenue. Then the Lotus slashed sideways, its fangs opening up the side of another cab like a can opener. The circle broke amid enraged roaring. Cabs circled and fainted while the first victim dragged itself away by its front wheels to collapse in the street. Everything started happening at once. Nita slashed at the front of the cab closest to her. The whip of moonfire cracking across its face seemed to confuse and frighten it, but did no damage. "I hope it doesn't notice that right away," she thought desperately, for there was no use yelling for help. Kit had his hands full. He had the antenna laid over his forearm again and was snapping off shot after shot of blinding hot light, cracking headlights, burning holes in hoods, and exploding tires, a hit here, a hit there. Nothing fatal, Nita noticed with dismay, but Kit was managing to hold the cabs at their distance as they harried him. Out in the street, one cab lunged at the Lotus, a leap, its front wheels clear of the ground and meant to come crashing down on the racer's hood, until suddenly the Lotus's nose dipped under the cab and heaved upward, sending the cab rolling helplessly onto its back. A second later, the Lotus came down on top of the cab, took a great shark bite out of its underbelly, and then whirled around, whipping gas and transmission fluid all over, to slash at another cab about to leap on it from behind. This was the King cab, the pack leader, and as the Lotus and the Checker circled one another warily in the street, the other cabs drew away from Kit and Nita to watch the outcome of the combat. There were two more cabs dead in the street that Nita hadn't seen fall, one with everything from right rear door to right front fender torn away, another horribly mangled in its front end and smashed sideways into a tree on the other side of Fifth, as if it had been thrown there. Amid the wreckage of these and the other two cabs, The cab and the Lotus rolled, turning and backing, maneuvering for an opening that would end in a kill. The Lotus was scored along one side, but otherwise unhurt, and the whining roar of its engine sounded hungry and pleased. Infuriated, the Checker made a couple of quick rushes at it, stopping short with a screech of tires and backing away again each time in a way that indicated it didn't want to close in. The Lotus snarled derisively, and without warning, the Checker swerved around and threw itself full speed at Kit and Nita, still braced against the wall. This is it, Nita thought with curious calm. She flung up the Rowan wand in one last useless slash, and then was thrown back against the wall with terrible force, as a thunderstorm of screaming metal flew from right to left in front of her, and crashed not 5 feet away. She slid down the wall, limp as a rag doll, stunned, aware that death had gone right past her face. When her eyes and ears started working again, the Lotus was standing off to her left, its back scornfully turned to the demolished pack leader, which it had slammed into the wall. The Checker looked like the remains of a front-end collision test. It was crumpled up into itself like an accordion and bleeding oil and gas in pools. The Lotus roared triumphant disdain at the remaining 2 cabs, then threatened them with a small, mean rush. They turned tail and ran a short distance, then slowed down and slunk away around the corner of 61st. Satisfied, the Lotus bent over the broken body of one dead cab, reached down, and with casual fierceness plucked away some of the front fender, as a falcon plucks its kill before eating. Nita turned her head to look for Kit. He was several feet farther down the wall, looking as shattered as she felt. He got up slowly and walked out into the street. The Lotus glanced up, left its kill, and went to meet him. For a moment they simply looked at each other from a few feet apart. Kit held one hand out, and the Lotus slowly inched forward under the hand, permitting the caress. They stood that way for the space of 4 or 5 gasps, and then the Lotus rolled closer still and pushed its face roughly against Kit's leg, like a cat. "How about that?" Kit said, his voice cracking. "How about that?" Nita put her face down in her hands, wanting very much to cry, but all she could manage were a couple of crooked, whooping sobs. She had a feeling that much worse was coming, and she couldn't break down all the way. Nita hid her eyes until she thought her voice was working again, then let her hands fall and looked up. "Kit, we've got to—" The Lotus had rolled up and was staring at her, a huge, dangerous, curious, brown-hided beast. She lost what she was saying, hypnotized by the fierce, interested stare. Then the Lotus smiled at Nita, a slow, chrome smile, silver and sanguine. She said, disconcerted, and glanced up at Kit, who had come to stand alongside the racer. "We've got to get out of here, Kit. It has to be the spell that brought these things down on us. And when those 2 cabs let you-know-who know that we didn't get caught or killed—" Kit nodded, looked down at the Lotus. It glanced sideways up at him from headlights bright with amusement and triumph. "How about it?" Kit said in the speech. "Could you give us a lift?" In answer, the Lotus shrugged, flicking its doors open like a bird spreading its wings. Nita stood up, staggering slightly. "Fred?" He appeared beside her, making a feeling of great shame. "Fred, what's the matter?" Kit said, catching it too. "I couldn't do anything." "Of course not," Nita said, reaching up to cup his faint spark in one hand. "Because you just did something huge, dummy. We're all right. Come on for a ride." She perched Fred on the upstanding collar of her down vest. He settled there with a sigh of light. Together she and Kit lowered themselves into the dark seats of the Lotus, into the dim, warm cockpit, alive with dials and gauges, smelling of leather and metal and oil. They had barely strapped themselves in before the Lotus gave a great, glad shake that slammed its doors shut and burned rubber down Fifth Avenue, out of the carnage and south toward the joining of two rivers and the oldest part of Manhattan. Nita sat at ease, taking a breather and watching the streets of Manhattan rush by. Kit, behind the steering wheel, was holding the dark book in his lap, feeling it carefully for any change in the directional spell. He was reluctant to touch it. The farther south they went, the more the book burned the eyes that looked at it. The Wizard's Manual had predicted this effect, that as the two books drew closer to one another, each would assert its own nature more and more forcefully. Nita watched the book warping and skewing the very air around it, blurring its own outlines, and found it easy to believe the manual's statement that even a mind of terrible enough purpose and power to wrench this book to its use might in the reading be devoured by what was read. She hoped for Kit's sake that it wouldn't devour someone who just touched it. "We're close," Kit said at last in a quiet, strained voice. "You okay?" "I've got a headache, but that's all." "Where are we?" That was just Pearl Street, close to City Hall." She tapped the inside of her door, a friendly gesture. "Your baby moves." "Yeah," Kit said affectionately. The Lotus rumbled under its hood, sped on. "Fred, you feeling better?" Fred looked up at her from her collar. "Somewhat. I'd feel better still if I knew what we were going to be facing next. If I'm to make bricks again, I'm going to need some notice." "You're Neister, huh?" Kit said. "I'm not sure I have a Neister anymore after that last emission, and I'm afraid to find out." "Kit, scrunch down," Nita said suddenly, doing the same herself. The Lotus roared past the corner of Broadway and Chambers, pointedly ignoring a pair of sullen-looking cabs that stared and snarled as it passed. They were parked on either side of an iron-railed stairway leading down to a subway station. About a block farther along Broadway, two more cabs were parked at another subway entrance. From his slumped-down position, Kit glanced over at Nita. "Those are the first we've seen." "The usual accesses," Nita said. "They've got it down in the subway somewhere." "Oh, no," Kit muttered, and "wonderful," Fred said. Nita swallowed, not too happy about the idea herself. Subway stations, unless they were well-lighted and filled with people, gave her the creeps. Worse, even in her New York, subways had their own special ecologies. Not just the mice and rats and cats that everybody knew about, but other, less normal creatures, on which the Wizard's Manual had had a 20-page chapter. "They're all over the place," she said aloud, dealing with the worst problem first. "How are we going to—" "Woof!" Kit said, as the dark book, sitting on his lap, sank down hard as if pushed. The Lotus kept driving on down Broadway, past City Hall, and Kit struggled upward to look out the back window, noting the spot. "That was where the other book was, straight down from that place we just passed." The Lotus turned right onto a side street and slowed as if looking for something. Finally, it pulled over to the left-hand curb and stopped. "What?" Kit started to say, but the racer flicked open first Kit's door, then Nita's, as if it wanted them to get out. They did, cautiously. The Lotus very quietly closed its doors. Then it rolled forward a little way, bumping up onto the sidewalk in front of a dingy-looking warehouse. It reached down, bared its fangs, and with great delicacy sank them into a 6-foot-long grill on the sidewalk. The Lotus heaved, and with a soft, scraping groan, the grillwork came up to reveal an electric-smelling darkness and stairs leading down into it. "It's one of the emergency exits from the subway, for when the trains break down," Kit whispered, jamming the dark book back into his backpack and dropping to his knees to rub the Lotus enthusiastically behind one headlight. "It's perfect!" The Lotus's engine purred as it stared at Kit with fierce affection. It backed a little and parked itself, its motions indicating it would wait for them. Kit got up, pulling out his antenna, and Nita got out her wand.